Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Tell me, is there a lamp burning where you are, perhaps a cup of tea close at hand? These are the hours Watson trusted most, when silence sharpens the mind and small details speak clearly. Do subscribe so no clue passes you by. Now, settle in. For the world is full of obvious things which nobody ever truly observes. You'll find the Watson's Margins Spotify channel in the description below. Chapter 1. A Gentleman of Uneasy Composure. It is a peculiarity of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most singular of cases have invariably commenced upon the most unremarkable of evenings. So it was on that particular Thursday in October, when the fog rolled thick and yellow along Baker Street and a fire burned with steady contentment in our sitting-room grate, that the events I am about to set down first announced themselves in the form of a hesitant knock upon our door. I had been engaged that evening in rereading a monograph on the treatment of tropical fevers, a subject which the dampness of the London autumn had rendered peculiarly relevant to my professional thoughts. Holmes sat opposite me in his customary attitude of concentrated repose, the long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes half closed, though I had learned long since that such apparent vacancy signified not idleness, but the most intense inner activity. He had said nothing for the better part of an hour, which in Baker Street parlance denoted a mood both settled and alert. Mrs. Hudson's footstep on the stair was followed by her respectful tap at the door. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes, a Mr. Penbury. He seems in some distress, sir, if you will pardon my saying so." Holmes opened his eyes fully at that. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, and be so good as to bring a second lamp. The fog this evening is particularly insistent." The man who entered our room a moment later was perhaps 50 years of age, well made and dressed with the careful propriety of a professional man conscious of appearances. His coat was of good wool, his boots freshly blacked, and his cravat arranged with precision. Yet for all this external order, there was about him an air of profound discomposure, as a well-built house might betray, upon closer inspection, the first cracks of a troubling subsidence. His hands, I noticed, were not quite steady. "Mr. Alistair Penbury," said Holmes, gesturing toward the basket chair with a languid wave. "Pray sit down, and do not trouble yourself to compose what you wish to say. I find that prepared speeches are invariably less useful than plain ones. You're a solicitor of some standing, I perceive, and something has occurred which distresses you not merely professionally but personally. The two are, in this instance, entangled." Penbury arrested his motion toward the chair, and regarded Holmes with the startled expression common to those experiencing his methods for the first time. "You're correct on every point, Mr. Holmes," he said, lowering himself carefully into the seat. "Though I confess I should be glad to know how you arrived at your conclusions before I've spoken a word. The callus upon your right middle finger is consistent with sustained pen work over many years, not the occasional correspondence mark, but the permanent inscription of a man whose profession is documentation. The ink stain at the base of your thumb, though partially scrubbed away, is of a particular viscous variety favoured in legal copying. Your watch chain carries a fob engraved, if I am not mistaken, with a scale of justice, the traditional ornament of a man called to the law. As for the personal dimension of your distress, that is evident in the manner in which you entered, Mr. Penbury. A man troubled only in his professional capacity holds himself erect and speaks first of facts. You entered looking at the floor." I observed our visitor absorb this quietly, with the air of a man who has braced himself for a cold plunge and finds the temperature precisely as forecast. "Very well," said he. "Then I shall speak plainly as you suggest, and trust to your discretion." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded document, which he placed upon the table before Holmes with a deliberateness that suggested the act had cost him something. Holmes unfolded it without haste and held it beneath the lamp. I drew my chair a degree closer, that I might observe without intruding. The document was, as I could see, a legal instrument of some complexity, bearing a notarial seal in red wax at its foot, and a signature above that seal. Holmes examined it for perhaps a full minute without speaking, his glass appearing from nowhere in the manner it habitually did, as though summoned by the occasion rather than removed from any pocket. "The estate of Mrs. Honoria Vexley," he said at last, not as a question. "The document purports to transfer the principal holdings of her estate, and your seal appears at the foot." "It does," said Penbury, and his voice was very even. "But I did not place it there, Mr. Holmes. I did not execute that document. I did not sign it. To the best of my knowledge and my conscience, that signature is not mine." "To the best of your knowledge," Holmes repeated, and I caught the slight inflection he placed upon those words, as a musician might lay emphasis upon a phrase that others have passed over carelessly. Penbury's eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. None, and in that fraction of a moment I thought I saw something move behind them, some recollection or apprehension not yet offered for examination. Then it was gone, and he said, in the same measured tone, "I am a solicitor of 30 years' standing, Mr. Holmes. I am not a young man who misplaces his signature. That document was not executed by me." Holmes set down his glass. "Tell me of Mrs. Vexley." "She died 6 weeks ago. A widow of some wealth, a woman of perhaps 70 years, possessed of a considerable estate in the county of Surrey. I had served as her solicitor for a decade, a straightforward professional arrangement. Her will was made and registered 3 years since, leaving the bulk of her property to various charitable trusts, with modest provisions for her niece, Miss Clara Vexley, and her household. And the document before me reassigns those provisions. It does. The document, which has been presented by a Mr. Bernard Lyle, a financier of some kind, purports to redirect the principal of the estate in its entirety. Mrs. Vexley, according to this instrument, wished the estate to pass to a trust administered by Lyle himself. Mrs. Vexley is no longer available to confirm or deny this wish. She is not." Holmes rose from his chair in that sudden, uncoiling movement that always preceded active engagement with a problem, and stood for a moment with his back to us both, looking into the fire. "Mr. Penbury," said he without turning, "you mentioned that Mrs. Vexley's affairs were, in your phrase, straightforward. Yet when I observed just now that the matter distresses you personally as well as professionally, you did not correct me. I should be obliged if you would tell me what it is about this case that carries for you a weight beyond the professional." The silence that followed was one of the most eloquent I can recall. Penbury sat very still, his hands resting on his knees with the careful placement of a man who trusts his hands, least when they are unoccupied. "Mrs. Vexley," he said at last, "was a woman with whom I had dealings, Mr. Holmes, some 20 years ago. Dealings of a legal nature which were, at the time, entirely concluded to the satisfaction of all parties. I should not wish those old matters to be unnecessarily disturbed." He paused. "That is all I am prepared to say at present." Holmes turned from the fire then, and I saw upon his face that expression of keen and pleasurable concentration that told me more clearly than any words that the case had, in that moment, become something considerably more interesting than the forgery of a single signature. "That," said he, "is precisely the sentence which most requires examination, Mr. Penbury. Old matters entirely concluded have a way, in my experience, of declining to remain so." He returned to his chair. "I shall look into this matter. Watson, be so good as to note the particulars. Mr. Penbury, I shall require the names of all persons connected with the Vexley household, and I shall require them before you leave this room." The fog pressed closer against the windows, the fire shifted in the grate, and the case which would, in the weeks that followed, reach back across 2 decades to illuminate a darkness older and more deliberate than I had yet suspected, formally began. Chapter 2. The Circle of Quiet Disturbance. The Vexley residence stood at the end of a long gravel drive in that particular quarter of Surrey where respectability has aged into something faintly mournful. The large houses sitting back from the road like elderly gentlemen, who have long since ceased to expect visitors, but have not yet abandoned the habit of dressing for dinner. It was a Friday morning when Holmes and I made the journey, the sky the colour of unpolished pewter, and the leaves along the lane browning at their edges with the first earnest intention of autumn. Holmes was silent for the greater part of the journey, which I had learned to interpret neither as absence of mind nor displeasure with company, but rather as the particular concentration he brought to bear upon a case before the evidence had fully declared itself. Penbury had provided his list of names the previous evening, and Holmes had studied it with the attention a chess player gives to an opening arrangement. Miss Clara Vexley, niece to the deceased, Mr. Bernard Lyle, financier, Mrs. Euphemia Dalloway, long-time companion of the household, Mr. Silas Finch, steward. These four, along with Penbury himself, constituted the principal circle of those connected to Mrs. Honoria Vexley's affairs, and it was among these four that Holmes proposed to begin. We were received at the door by Finch himself, a compact grey-haired man of perhaps 60, whose manner was that of a steward of the old school, correct in every particular and entirely impossible to read. He showed us into a drawing-room of considerable size, furnished with the accumulation of a long life rather than the intention of a decorator, and withdrew with a precision of movement that struck me as somehow over-rehearsed, like an actor who has been too long in the same role. The room held 3 of our 4 subjects. Miss Clara Vexley rose at our entrance, a woman in her mid-30s, plainly but well dressed, with a composure of face that seemed less natural than carefully maintained. Her eyes were an attentive grey, and moved between Holmes and myself with an appraising intelligence that she made no effort to conceal. Beside the fireplace stood Bernard Lyle, a broad, prosperous man of 50 or so, whose colour was rather high, and whose handshake, when he extended it, was of the emphatic variety employed by men who have discovered that confidence, projected outward with sufficient force, tends to be accepted as competence. In the far corner, half turned toward the window, sat Mrs. Dalloway, a small woman somewhere past 60, dressed in the deepest black of recent mourning, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that was not quite peace. Holmes moved through the room in his deceptively idle fashion, pausing to examine a watercolour upon the wall, lifting briefly a small bronze from the mantelpiece, and in general conducting himself in a manner which the casual observer might have taken for distraction, but which I knew to be the most focused kind of attention. He asked, to begin with, the questions one might expect, inquiring of the household's routine, of Mrs. Vexley's health in her final weeks, of the arrangements for the estate. The answers were civil, measured, and largely unrevealing. It was when he introduced the subject of the disputed document that the quality of the room changed, though I should be hard-pressed to say precisely how. No one started. No one spoke out of turn. And yet something shifted in the air, as when a draught finds its way beneath a door that has been thought securely closed. Lyle spoke most readily. The document was, in his account, entirely legitimate, a late expression of Mrs. Vexley's wishes, communicated to him personally and subsequently formalised. He had presented it through the proper channels. If the notary's signature was disputed, that was a matter for the courts, and he had every confidence the matter would be resolved in due course. He spoke throughout, with the particular fluency of a man who has prepared his answers carefully, though not carefully enough to disguise that he had done so. Clara Vexley, by contrast, said little. When Holmes turned to her directly, asking whether she had been present when her aunt expressed any wish to revise her testamentary arrangements, she replied that she had not, and that she found the document both unexpected and inexplicable. Her voice was quiet and her gaze did not waver. Holmes regarded her for a moment with what I can only describe as attentive neutrality before moving on. Mrs. Dalloway, when addressed, answered in short, precise sentences that gave away nothing beyond the surface of the question asked. She had been Mrs. Vexley's companion for 14 years. She had observed no change in her late mistress's intentions regarding the estate. She was unfamiliar with the document in question. Each answer arrived a beat too quickly, as though the precise question had been anticipated and the response held ready, and twice she brought her replies to a close on a topic slightly different from the one Holmes had raised, a small but practiced deflection. Finch returned twice during the course of our visit, once with tea and once on an errand of minor household business, and each time Holmes contrived, with an ease that looked entirely accidental, to draw him briefly into the conversation. The steward's answers were meticulous to a degree that itself invited examination. He recalled dates with a precision uncommon in a man for whom those dates could have held no particular significance, and he spoke of the late Mrs. Vexley with the restrained sentiment of the professional retainer, his phrasing so well judged as to suggest it had been judged beforehand. It was as we were preparing to take our leave that Holmes, in the manner of a man recalling an afterthought, paused in the doorway and remarked, pleasantly and to the room in general, that it was remarkable how often, in cases of disputed documentation, the difficulty traced itself not to anything recent, but to affairs that had their roots many years in the past. He let the observation stand without elaboration, and then bade the company good afternoon. In the lane outside, with the gravel crunching under our boots and the house at our backs, I waited for Holmes to speak. "You observed them," he said at last. It was not a question. I did. Lyle was expansive to the point of calculation. Clara Vexley struck me as genuinely surprised, though she conceals her feelings admirably. Mrs. Dalloway was evasive in a methodical sort of way, as though evasion were a skill she had practised. And Finch, I said, considering, spoke as though he were giving evidence. Holmes paused in his walk and looked at me with an expression that in another man I should have called warm. Watson, that is precisely the right observation at precisely the right moment. He spoke as though he were giving evidence, and more importantly as though he had resolved long ago what that evidence should contain. He resumed his stride. "Did you notice anything else about them, taken as a company?" I confessed that I was not certain what he meant. When I introduced the phrase concerning the notary's signature, all four of them reacted, Watson. Not with surprise, with recognition. There is a considerable difference, and in that difference, I suspect, lies the greater part of this case. He glanced at the sky, which had taken on the particular flat grey of afternoon rain preparing itself without haste. They are not strangers to this subject, any of them. They are people who have been waiting in their various fashions for this subject to arrive. We reached the road and turned toward the waiting cab. Behind us, I was almost certain, one of the drawing-room curtains had been displaced, as though by someone who had watched us go and wished to be certain that we had. The rain, when it came, was quiet and persistent, and accompanied us all the way back to London without apology. And Chapter 3, The Document and the Death. The telegram arrived at Baker Street on Saturday morning while Holmes was engaged in one of his chemical experiments, the results of which had rendered the upper landing rather less habitable than usual. I was breakfasting alone when Mrs. Hudson brought it up, and I confess I read it with some unease before carrying it through to Holmes, who stood at his bench in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, with the focused disregard for domestic comfort that characterised his working hours. He read it without expression, set it beside his retort, and read it again. Then he removed his India rubber gloves with deliberate care and said, "Bernard Lyle is dead, Watson. Found in his study this morning by his housekeeper. The telegram is from Lestrade, who has the matter in hand and requests our attendance." I had seen enough of sudden death in my years at Baker Street not to be unduly startled, but I will admit that the news produced in me a particular coldness that went beyond the merely professional. We had sat in the same room as Bernard Lyle not 24 hours since, and he had seemed, for all his calculation, entirely vigorous. How? I asked. Lestrade does not commit himself. He says only that the circumstances are ambiguous and that there is a document involved. Holmes was already moving toward his bedroom. "Eat your breakfast, Watson. It will be a long morning." Lyle's house was a handsome double-fronted property in Kensington, the home of a man who had prospered, and wished the fact to be generally known. And Inspector Lestrade met us at the door with his customary expression of combined relief and barely suppressed scepticism, the particular look of a man who is grateful for assistance and slightly resentful of the need for it. "Nasty business," said he, drawing us inside. "Or a clean one, depending on how you look at it. The housekeeper found him at 7:30 this morning when he failed to appear for breakfast. He was at his desk. The door was locked from the inside and had to be forced. The window, Holmes asked, latched. Ground floor, giving onto the rear garden. No sign of disturbance inside or out." The study was a well-appointed room lined with ledgers and bound volumes that had the look of furniture rather than reading, their spines unbroken and their arrangement decorative. Lyle sat, or rather had sat, in a leather chair behind a substantial desk, slumped forward with one arm outstretched. A glass of brandy stood at his right hand, still containing perhaps a third of its measure, and upon the desk before him lay a single sheet of paper. I went to the body directly, as was my function, while Holmes went to the document. My examination was thorough and took perhaps 10 minutes. Lestrade waited in the doorway with the patience of a man who has learned, at some personal cost, that interrupting Holmes or his companion in the early stages of an inquiry produces no useful result. When I stood and turned, Holmes was still bent over the desk, his lens moving across the paper in slow, methodical arcs. "Well, Watson?" "The immediate cause of death is consistent with cardiac failure," I said carefully. "There are no marks of violence upon the body that I can identify. He is fully dressed, which suggests he did not retire last night, or return to his study after doing so. I should place the time of death somewhere between 10 o'clock last night and 2 o'clock this morning." I paused. "There is a faint smell, Holmes, about the mouth and on the fingertips of the right hand. Sweet, almost medicinal. I should want a proper post-mortem examination before I committed myself to any conclusion, but I would not be satisfied with a verdict of natural causes." Holmes straightened. "Nor should you be. Come and look at this." The document on the desk was, as I saw immediately, a copy of the instrument Penbury had brought to Baker Street, or something very close to it, the same notarial seal, the same transfer of the Vexley estate. But Holmes directed my attention not to its content but to its position. It lay precisely centred upon the blotter, turned to face whoever sat across the desk rather than toward the man in the chair. A man reviewing his own papers arranges them for his own convenience. This document had been placed for another reader. "It was arranged after death," said Holmes, "or by someone who knew that death was imminent and wished a particular scene to be discovered. Note also the ink here, at the lower margin." He indicated with his lens a small mark, barely visible at the foot of the page, a partial impression as of a finger pressed in fresh ink and then quickly withdrawn. Someone handled this document while the ink at the notary's signature was still wet. That is not consistent with a document of the age it purports to be. Lestrade advanced into the room, "Your meaning being?" "That the document was not merely forged, but recently forged. Within the past week, I should judge. The paper has been subjected to artificial aging, a technique not unknown to those familiar with legal fraud, but the ink itself betrays the truth." Holmes set down his glass and moved to the window, examining the latch with brief attention before turning back to the room. "Tell me, Lestrade, when were these premises last entered before the housekeeper found him this morning?" "Lyle had a visitor yesterday evening. The housekeeper admitted a woman at 8:30 and showed her to the drawing-room. Lyle came down, spoke with her privately, and she left approximately 40 minutes later. The housekeeper did not see her face clearly, describes her only as a woman of middle age, quietly dressed, and in some agitation when she arrived. When she left," Lestrade consulted his notebook. "Composed, the housekeeper says. Notably so, given the state she arrived in." Holmes said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the brandy glass with the concentrated attention he might have given a rare document. "Has that glass been touched since it was found?" "It has not." "I know your methods, Mr. Holmes, well enough for that." "Then have it preserved carefully. Watson's instinct regarding the smell is sound, and I believe the glass will confirm it." He turned to me. "There is no suicide note, Watson. A man who takes his own life in his own locked study typically leaves some account of his reasons, particularly when those reasons are as considerable as Lyle's would have been. The absence is telling. As we stepped back into the hall, Lestrade fell into step beside us with the air of a man who has been withholding a question and has now run out of patience for the withholding. "So it is murder, then? By this woman visitor?" "It is murder," said Holmes, "by someone who was sufficiently close to Lyle to be admitted to his house in the evening, sufficiently composed to complete the act, arrange the scene, and leave without disturbance, and sufficiently knowledgeable about the contents of that document to understand precisely what message its placement would convey." He took his hat from the hall stand. "Whether those qualities reside in your mysterious visitor or in another party is a question that requires rather more evidence than we presently possess." We emerged into the grey Kensington morning, and I pulled my coat about me against the chill. Holmes walked with his head slightly forward, his hands deep in his pockets, in the attitude of a man following an invisible path. "The document and the death," I said, half to myself, recalling Holmes's habit of framing cases in their simplest terms. "Are they products of the same hand?" "They share a purpose," said Holmes. "Whether they share an author is the question that will take us, Watson, a good deal further back than last Thursday evening." He raised his arm for a cab, considerably further back, and into ground considerably less comfortable. The cab came, and we rode in silence toward Baker Street, where, I knew, the real work was only beginning. Chapter 4. Ink that Tells No Lies. Holmes did not sleep that night, or if he did, it was in one of those brief, purposeful intervals of unconsciousness that served him in place of the sustained rest ordinary men require. When I came down to breakfast on Sunday morning, he was already at the table, not eating, but surrounded by the forged document, a magnifying lens, 3 small glass slides, and a copy of a chemical reference volume he'd retrieved from the lower shelf. 2 pipes had been smoked, and the tobacco jar stood open. He had the alert, slightly febrile look of a man who's been thinking productively for several hours and is not yet ready to stop. I poured my tea and waited. "The ink is the thing, Watson," he said, without preliminary. "Sit down and I will show you something instructive." He passed me the lens and indicated a section of the document's signature with the tip of a pencil, careful not to touch. Under magnification, the signature resolved into something rather different from what the naked eye suggested. The individual strokes were slightly too uniform, lacking the microscopic irregularities of a hand writing at natural speed, and along the upper curve of the principal letter there was a faint hesitation, a barely perceptible thickening where the forger had paused for a fraction of a second too long. "A skilled piece of work," Holmes said. "Whoever executed this had practiced the signature beforehand, possibly many times. The hand is steady and the general impression is convincing. But forgery under any degree of care produces exactly that quality of overcorrectness. A man signing his own name does not think about the act. The forger, however accomplished, always does. And the ink itself." He lifted one of the glass slides, on which a minute sample had been fixed. "Iron gall ink, Watson, of a formulation that has been effectively obsolete for 30 years. The particular combination of tannic compounds and ferrous sulfate, visible under analysis, places its manufacture no later than the mid-1860s, possibly earlier. It has survived because iron gall, properly stored, is remarkably stable. Someone possessed a supply of this ink and preserved it deliberately, or inherited a quantity without understanding or caring about its age." He set the slide down. "In either case, the ink was chosen to match the apparent date of the document, which the forger wished to appear consistent with instruments executed by Penbury 2 decades ago. The implication settled over me as I drank my tea. Then whoever forged it had foreknowledge of Penbury's earlier work. They knew the vintage of ink he used at that period. More than that, they knew where to obtain a matching supply, or had kept one in reserve. This is not the work of an opportunist, Watson. It is the work of someone who has been preparing this particular act, or something very like it, for a very long time." He rose and moved to the window, looking down at the Sunday quiet of Baker Street, which returns us, inevitably, to the question of what occurred 20 years ago and why its participants have maintained their silence with such remarkable consistency. He turned from the window with sudden decision. I intend to call upon each of our 4 subjects separately today. I should be glad of your company, though I warn you that 2 of the visits will be unremarkable, and one will be, I think, rather revealing. The difficulty is that I do not yet know which. We began with Penbury, whom Holmes had summoned by note to his own office in Holborn. A tall, book-lined room smelling of beeswax and old paper, in which the solicitor received us with the careful courtesy of a man who was resolved to maintain appearances whatever the internal cost. Holmes questioned him on the matter of the ink, watching his face as he described the obsolete formulation and its implications. Penbury's response was a controlled blankness, neither surprised nor unsurprised, the expression of a man receiving confirmation of something he had already feared. Holmes pressed him, with exquisite politeness, on the subject of his seal, specifically on who, beyond himself, had ever had access to it. Penbury maintained that it had been kept in a locked drawer of his private desk for the past 15 years, and that prior to that it had been stored in a strong-box at his chambers. He could not account for how it had been used, and said so with the weary precision of a man who has turned the same question over many times in private and arrived each time at the same unsatisfying answer. Clara Vexley received us at the Vexley house, where she was now in residence for the purposes of settling the estate. She was composed and practical, and answered Holmes's questions about the document with the directness of someone who has nothing to conceal on that particular subject, and is mildly frustrated that concealment should even be suspected. When Holmes inquired, gently, whether she'd been aware of any business dealings between her late aunt and a man named Elias Rookwood, something moved in her eyes, quickly suppressed. "The name is not entirely unfamiliar," she said, after a pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than ordinary recollection requires. "I believe I heard it once, as a child. My aunt's manner when it was mentioned was such that I knew better than to inquire further." Holmes thanked her and did not pursue it. But as we left, I noted that he was wearing the expression of a man who has confirmed a theorem rather than discovered a new one. Mrs. Dalloway, by contrast, was not available. A message delivered by Finch informed us that she had retired to the room she occupied in the east wing with a headache, and that she was not receiving visitors. Holmes regarded the closed door of that wing for a moment with an attention disproportionate to its apparent interest, then asked Finch, in the most conversational of tones, whether Mrs. Dalloway had been much afflicted by headaches in recent years. Finch said that she had not, that she enjoyed, as a rule, excellent health. "How interesting," said Holmes pleasantly, "that it should come upon her today." It was Finch himself who provided the most material of the day's developments, though he did not intend to do so. Holmes had engaged him in conversation on the pretext of clarifying certain household arrangements, and in the course of this exchange produced, with the air of a man consulting his notes, a sheet of paper bearing a version of the forged document in which 2 minor details had been silently altered. The alteration was subtle, the kind of difference that only someone familiar with the original would detect. Finch detected it. The recognition lasted no more than a fraction of a second, a slight tightening about the eyes, and a barely perceptible arrest of breath, but I had been watching for precisely that response, and I saw it clearly. He recovered himself at once and examined the paper with the expression of a man seeing it for the first time, but the damage, if damage it was, had been done. Holmes thanked him, folded the paper and pocketed it. In the cab returning to London, Holmes was quiet for a long while, watching the Surrey countryside yield gradually to the advancing suburbs. At length he said, "Finch was a clerk in Penbury's firm 20 years ago, Watson. I confirmed it this morning from the Law Society records. A young clerk of modest means, handling the paperwork of senior partners, in a position, in other words, to know a great deal about the instruments that pass through those offices." He laced his fingers together, "including the ink." The cab rattled on, I watched Holmes's profile against the window and knew, from the particular quality of his stillness, that the case had entered a new phase, one in which the evidence was no longer scattered but beginning, piece by careful piece, to cohere into a shape that had always been there, waiting for the right angle of a light. "You said this morning that someone had been preparing this act for a very long time," I remarked. "I did." He did not turn from the window. "I'm becoming increasingly persuaded, Watson, that I was guilty of understatement." Chapter 5. A Memory Resurfaces. There are cases in which Holmes moves with the swift, undeviating purpose of a man who can see his destination clearly and requires only the time to reach it. This was not, I came to understand during the days that followed, one of those cases. It was rather one of those more unsettling investigations in which the forward motion is largely invisible, conducted in archives and record offices and the dusty back rooms of institutions that have outlasted the events they chronicle, and in which Holmes would disappear for hours at a time, returning to Baker Street with the abstracted inward look of a man assembling a mechanism whose individual parts are now understood but whose final configuration is not yet fixed. He did not share his researches freely during this period, which was his habit when the matter was still in formation, and I had learned not to press him. I occupied myself with my practice, and with such notes as I could make of the case thus far, waited. It was on the Wednesday, 4 days after our second visit to Surrey, that he returned to Baker Street in the early evening with the first light of settled conviction in his eyes. He dropped 2 manila folders onto the table, removed his coat, and said, without sitting down, "Elias Rookwood, Watson, tell me what you make of this." The folders contained a collection of documents assembled with Holmes's characteristic thoroughness. Records from the county court at Guildford, a set of newspaper cuttings from the Surrey Advertiser and the London Illustrated News spanning a period of some 3 years in the late 1870s, extracts from land registry entries, and 2 folded pages of Holmes's own notes written in his compressed angular hand. I read in silence while Holmes stood at the mantelpiece and filled his pipe. The outline that emerged from these materials was as follows. Elias Rookwood had been, in the late 1870s, a landowner of modest but genuine substance, possessed of a farm and several acres of reasonably productive Surrey land that had been in his family for 2 generations. In 1878 he had become embroiled in a legal dispute with Mrs. Honoria Vexley, then recently widowed and in the process of consolidating her late husband's considerable property holdings. The dispute concerned a boundary and a right-of-way, commonplace in themselves, but complicated by the existence of a prior deed of entailment that Rookwood claimed gave his family an irrevocable interest in a portion of the land Mrs. Vexley was seeking to absorb. The case had come before the county court and had been decided, after some months of legal proceedings, in Mrs. Vexley's favour. Rookwood had appealed. The appeal had collapsed. He had died 14 months after the final judgment, in circumstances the newspaper accounts described as a sudden decline of health, a phrase which the medical man in me recognised as the Victorian press's customary veil over deaths that did not invite closer examination. He left no family, and the land, duly transferred, had become part of the Vexley estate. What made the matter considerably more than a routine property dispute was the name of the solicitor who had appeared for Mrs. Vexley throughout the proceedings. Alistair Penbury. And the name of the junior clerk who had prepared and filed the principal documentary submissions on Penbury's behalf, Silas Finch. "The prior deed," I said, looking up. "The one Rookwood claimed established his entitlement. It was never produced in court." It was not. The record shows that Penbury submitted a sworn affidavit attesting to a thorough search of the relevant archives, concluding that no such deed could be located and that Rookwood's claim was therefore unsubstantiated. Holmes drew on his pipe. "I spent yesterday afternoon at the Surrey Land Registry. The deed exists, Watson. It has existed continuously. It was misfiled under an adjacent property reference in a manner that might have been a genuine clerical error, but which had the convenient effect of rendering it unfindable by anyone who did not know precisely where to look. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, a cab passed along Baker Street, its lamp throwing a brief yellow ellipse across the ceiling. Then Penbury knew it was there, I said. He knew, or he was in a position where he chose not to look too carefully. The distinction, in law, is material. In conscience, rather less so. Holmes moved from the mantelpiece and settled into his chair, his elbows on the arms and his pipe held in both hands. Bernard Lyle financed Mrs. Vexley's legal costs throughout the dispute at a rate of interest that became, upon the acquisition of the land, a share in the property's value. He did not appear in the proceedings. His role was entirely private. Mrs. Dalloway was present in the household at the time and attended every day of the court hearing, which is interesting for a companion whose engagement was ostensibly domestic. She was a witness to events as they unfolded. She was a witness to something. Whether she witnessed the misfiling or merely its consequences is a question I have not yet resolved. He paused. What I am certain of is that Rookwood knew, or very strongly suspected, that the deed had been suppressed. He said as much in a letter to the court which the newspaper accounts describe as intemperate. The case was decided against him regardless, and he died within the year. Holmes set his pipe in the rack with the deliberate care that signified a thought being placed in order alongside others. Finch was 23 years old at the time, a junior clerk, sufficiently junior to be given the filing and sufficiently intelligent to understand what he had done, or been directed to do. I considered this for a moment. You think he has carried the knowledge ever since? I think he has carried rather more than knowledge. I think he has carried guilt of the particular, corrosive variety that does not diminish with time but compounds it, feeding upon the silence that sustains it. Holmes looked into the fire, and at some point in the recent past, for reasons I have not yet fully established, he determined that the silence had gone on long enough. The forged document, I said slowly. It was not for profit. It was a mirror. Holmes glanced at me with that swift, approving attention he rarely gave. A mirror, yes. The same crime, performed again, in miniature, for an audience of those who would recognize it. Not to defraud, but to remind, to force into the open what 20 years of comfortable prosperity had buried. He rose abruptly. There are two further questions that require answers before the picture is complete. The first is the source of Finch's access to Penbury's seal. The second, and considerably more urgent, is why Lyle died when he did. You believe the timing was not accidental? In my experience, Watson, timing in these affairs is never accidental. Lyle died the night before Penbury had arranged to discuss the disputed document formally with representatives of the estate. Whatever Lyle knew, or whatever he had decided to do, his death was contrived to prevent a particular conversation from taking place. He took his coat from the hook by the door, which suggests that someone other than Finch was aware of what was being set in motion and took their own measure in response. I reached for my own coat. Where are we going? To pay a call on Inspector Lestrade. The post-mortem results will be available by now, and I have some questions about the provenance of that brandy glass. He opened the door onto the landing, after which, I believe a second visit to the Vexley house is overdue. Mrs. Dalloway's headache, Watson, has surely run its course by now. Chapter 6. The Weight of a Shared Secret. Lestrade received us at Scotland Yard in the manner of a man who has been waiting rather longer than he considers reasonable, and is prepared to say so. He was standing at the window of his office when we were shown in, his hands clasped behind his back, and he turned with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing an opening remark and has decided, upon reflection, to abandon it. The post-mortem is confirmed, he said, dispensing with preamble. Aconitine, introduced as your colleague suspected by way of the brandy. The glass retained sufficient residue for the analysis to be unambiguous. The amount administered was not large, but it was precise. Whoever prepared it knew something of the proper measure. Or had access to someone who did, said Holmes, settling himself into the chair opposite Lestrade's desk without being invited. The visitor of Saturday evening, Lestrade. Have you made further inquiries? We have. The housekeeper recalls that the woman arrived on foot rather than by cab, which is suggestive given the hour in the neighbourhood. She was admitted without hesitation, which indicates Lyle knew her and had perhaps been expecting her. The housekeeper's description, such as it is, corresponds in general terms to a woman of middle age, dark-coated, unremarkable in appearance. He paused. It corresponds, I should say, to several women of our acquaintance in this matter. Holmes acknowledged this with a slight inclination of his head. The aconitine, he said. Its preparation in any useful concentration requires either pharmaceutical training or access to professional materials. It is not a substance one encounters casually. We are making inquiries at the relevant establishments. Lestrade's tone suggested these inquiries had so far been unrewarding. Is there anything you can tell me, Mr. Holmes, that would assist in narrowing the field? In due course, said Holmes, which was not the answer Lestrade had been hoping for, and his expression made this clearly known. I can tell you with reasonable confidence that Lyle's death was not the primary object of whoever set this matter in motion. It was a consequence, and an unwelcome one, of something that had already gone considerably further than its author intended. That distinction will matter before we are finished. Lestrade looked at him for a long moment. It will matter rather more to the judge and jury, he said dryly. We left him with instructions for the preservation of the remaining evidence, and took the evening train back to Surrey, arriving at the Vexley house as the last of the daylight was abandoning the sky with that particular reluctance autumn evenings in the English countryside seemed to carry as a matter of character. Finch admitted us without visible surprise, which itself was informative. We were shown this time not to the drawing-room but to a smaller sitting-room at the rear of the house, a less public space, and I noted as I passed through the hall that the door to the east wing corridor stood open, where on our previous visits it had been closed. Mrs. Dalloway was present. She sat in a high-backed chair near the window, her hands in her lap, and she received our entrance with the composed stillness of a woman who has decided upon a particular bearing and intends to maintain it regardless of provocation. Her colour was perhaps a shade less certain than on our first meeting, but her eyes were steady. Holmes sat down across from her without ceremony. Mrs. Dalloway, he said, I think we may now speak rather more directly than has been possible on previous occasions. The post-mortem examination of Mr. Lyle's body was completed this morning. The result removes any ambiguity about the manner of his death. Something altered in her expression. Not alarm precisely, but a very slight adjustment as a ship makes in response to a change in the wind that only the experienced sailor detects. That is a grave matter, she said. It is. I wonder if you might tell me when you last saw Mr. Lyle. The pause was brief, and I believed, in the context of everything I now knew, that it was calculated rather than natural. Some days ago, she said, before his death was known to us here. You did not visit him on Saturday evening? I did not. Her voice was entirely level. Holmes regarded her with the patient attention of a man who is content to wait, and whose patience, unlike ordinary patience, does not diminish. Mrs. Dalloway, he said at last, I am going to tell you what I know of events that took place in 1878, and I should be grateful if you would correct me where I am in error. What followed was, in my experience of Holmes's methods, one of the more remarkable passages of an investigation already rich in incident. He laid out the Rookwood affair quietly and without accusation, its facts assembled in plain sequence, the suppressed deed, the fraudulent proceedings, the careful distribution of benefit among those who had participated. He named no villain and drew no explicit conclusion. He simply reconstructed, with the accuracy I had come to expect of him and the restraint I had come to admire, what had occurred and who had been present for each part of it. Mrs. Dalloway listened without interrupting. As the account progressed, the composure she'd maintained so steadfastly began to show, not cracks precisely, but a kind of fatigue, as plasterwork will sometimes reveal, beneath its smooth surface the pressures that have been acting upon it for years from within. When Holmes finished, there was a silence of perhaps half a minute. Then she said in a voice from which something had gone that had been there before, "You are substantially correct. I thought I might be. I was not a principal in it," she said. "I want that understood. Honoria determined on the course of action. Penbury provided the legal mechanism. Lyle supplied the money and understood perfectly what he was financing. I was asked to attend the proceedings and to be available if required to speak to Mrs. Vexley's character." She looked down at her hands. "I was a witness to the shape of it, not a director of it." "But you knew the deed existed." "I knew." The two words carried a weight that seemed to press down upon the room. I knew what Finch had been instructed to do with it. I said nothing. Yeah, because Honoria was my employer and my security, and because I told myself it was a legal matter, and that I was not qualified to judge it. She looked up. "I have told myself a great many things over 20 years, Mr. Holmes, and I have believed fewer and fewer of them as time has gone on." Holmes's voice, when he responded, was neither harsh nor merciful, but entirely direct. "And when Finch came to you recently, having decided that the silence should end, what did he ask of you?" Her stillness became, for just a moment, absolute. Then she said, "He did not come to me. He wrote. A letter 6 weeks ago, shortly after Honoria died. He said that he intended to ensure the truth became known, that he had kept certain materials for precisely this purpose, and that he believed the time had come to use them." She paused. "He told us what he meant to do." "You communicated this to Lyle." "I did." Her voice was barely above speaking level now. Bernard's response was immediate and entirely in keeping with his character. He said the matter could be managed, that Finch could be persuaded, or if not persuaded, then discredited, that a former clerk's word, against the accumulated respectability of those he proposed to accuse, was worth precisely nothing. She straightened slightly. "He was not a man who experienced uncertainty, Mr. Holmes. He found it inconvenient in others, and refused it in himself." Holmes stood. "Thank you, Mrs. Dalloway. I shall ask you to remain available for further conversation." In the hallway, Finch was nowhere to be seen. The east wing door had been quietly closed again in our absence. Holmes paused at the foot of the stairs and looked upward for a moment, and I had the impression he was not seeing the staircase at all, but rather the full structure of the case as it now stood, each piece newly illuminated by what had just been placed before us. "She told you nearly everything," I said, when we had reached the drive. "Nearly," Holmes agreed. "What she did not tell us is the more important part." He turned up his collar against the night air. "She told us what Lyle said he would do. She did not tell us what she did in response." Chapter 7. A Plausible Villain. Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street on Thursday morning with the air of a man carrying good news and uncertain of his welcome, a combination that produced in him a particular species of restrained satisfaction. Like a schoolboy who has solved a problem set by a master he does not entirely trust. He declined Mrs. Hudson's offer of tea, which was itself unusual, and settled himself in the basket chair with the bearing of a man who intends to take command of the conversation before it takes command of him. "I have been making inquiries," he began, "of a rather productive nature." Holmes, who was at the table with a collection of land registry documents spread before him, did not look up immediately. "Miss Clara Vexley," he said. Lestrade's satisfaction acquired a slightly deflated quality. "You anticipated me." "I anticipated the direction of an investigation conducted by a capable man with access to the evidence we have so far assembled. Clara Vexley is the obvious candidate, Lestrade, and you're not a man who overlooks the obvious. Tell me what you have found." Somewhat mollified by this characterization, Lestrade produced his notebook. Miss Clara Vexley, he explained, had been residing in London for the past 2 years, employed in a modest administrative capacity at a legal publisher in Chancery Lane. Her circumstances were comfortable rather than prosperous. She'd been aware, since her aunt's death, that the estate she had reasonable cause to expect would provide for her had been substantially redirected by the document bearing Penbury's forged signature. Her motive was therefore direct and financial. Her opportunity was, if anything, more compelling. She had been present at the Vexley house throughout the period in question, with full access to its rooms and its inhabitants. She was, by her own account, the only person who had explored the house's contents in detail following her aunt's death, engaged ostensibly in the preparation of an inventory. Among those contents, as Lestrade had established by inquiry, was a writing cabinet in Mrs. Vexley's private sitting room, kept locked during the old woman's lifetime and opened by Clara after her death. The cabinet had contained, among other documents, a collection of materials relating to Penbury's professional dealings with the estate over the preceding decade, including presumably specimens of his signature, I said. At minimum 3 letters in his own hand, Lestrade confirmed, and 2 formal instruments bearing his notarial seal, the impressions clear enough to have been used as the basis for a reproduction. He closed his notebook with the emphasis of a man concluding an argument. She had the motive, the materials, and the access. She is also, I am told, a woman of considerable intelligence and composure. I looked at Holmes, who had by this point set down his documents, and was listening with his fingers steepled and his gaze fixed somewhere above Lestrade's head. There was something in his expression that I could not immediately classify. It was not disagreement exactly, nor was it the particular alertness with which he greeted a new piece of evidence. It was closer, I thought, to the look of a man observing a well-constructed bridge and noticing, almost despite himself, a flaw in the engineering that the builder has not yet seen. "What you have assembled," Holmes said at last, "is a case that would satisfy a coroner's jury and might well satisfy a criminal one. The motive is sound. The opportunity is demonstrable, and Clara Vexley has, as you say, precisely the qualities of character that the successful execution of such a scheme would require." He paused. "There is, however, a question it does not answer. Which is?" "The ink." Holmes rose and went to the mantelpiece, where several of his reference volumes were stacked. The forged signature was executed in iron gall ink, of a formulation obsolete for 3 decades. Clara Vexley is a woman of 35. She was 5 years old when that ink was last commercially produced. The specimens of Penbury's signature she found in the writing cabinet would have been executed in the standard inks of the 1880s and 90s, not in the antique formulation used in the forgery. He turned. A forger working from those specimens, however accomplished, he would have used whatever ink came to hand, or at most sought an approximate match. The specific ink used in the forgery was not approximate, it was exact. Its exactness required either very long premeditation or access to materials accumulated and preserved over decades. Lestrade was quiet for a moment. She might have found the ink in the writing cabinet as well. She might, Holmes allowed. It is not impossible. But consider the totality, Lestrade. The forgery replicates not merely Penbury's signature, but the precise character of the original fraud. Its construction reflects a detailed understanding of the Rookwood proceedings, of the ink used in that period, of the specific nature of the crime it mirrors. That understanding belongs most naturally to someone who was present for the original events, not to a child of 5 who heard a name spoken once and knew enough to ask no questions about it. Lestrade absorbed this with the expression of a man revising his sums. "You're not saying she is innocent. I am saying that I am not yet certain she is guilty of the forgery, which is a considerably different thing." Holmes returned to his chair. Her innocence in the matter of the document does not preclude other kinds of knowledge or action. It is entirely possible that she discovered the truth of the Rookwood affair through the materials in that cabinet, and that this discovery set other events in motion, even if she did not herself forge the instrument. "You mean she might have approached one of the others? Finch, for instance." "The possibility is worth examining." Lestrade put away his notebook with the thoughtful deliberation of a man who is not abandoning his theory, but is for the moment carrying it at a different angle. "I have not yet spoken with Finch directly," he said. "I thought, given your interest in the matter, that I might be guided by you on the proper moment." "Leave Finch to me for the present," said Holmes. "There is one further thing I should like to establish before that conversation takes place." He looked at the inspector with the directness he reserved for moments of genuine instruction. Speak with Clara Vexley again, Lestrade, but not about the document. Ask her about the weeks immediately before her aunt's death. Ask her specifically whether her aunt showed any signs of agitation, or received any unusual correspondence, and whether she herself received any communication from any member of the household in that period. He paused. And ask her, as casually as you are able, whether she knows what her aunt kept in the locked lower drawer of that writing cabinet. Not the upper section, which you have described, but the lower. Lestrade's eyes sharpened. There was a lower drawer? There was. I observed its dimensions when I was briefly in that room during our first visit. It had been opened recently, the scratches around the lock were fresh, and it had been opened with rather more force than a key would require. Holmes picked up his pipe. Whatever it contained is no longer there. I should very much like to know what it was, and who removed it. After Lestrade had gone, I sat for some time turning the conversation over in my mind. The case against Clara Vexley had seemed, while Lestrade was presenting it, very nearly complete, and there was a part of me that had been prepared to accept it. It was only in Holmes's measured, unhurried dismantling of its certainties that I had felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath what had seemed stable footing. "You do not believe she forged the document," I said, "but you are not prepared to say so flatly." Holmes struck a match and held it over his pipe bowl. "I am not prepared to say it flatly because I am not yet in possession of the final piece, which is Finch's own account." He looked at me through the first thin curl of smoke. "When a man has carried a secret for 20 years and finally determines to reveal it, Watson, no, he does not do so carelessly. He prepares, he arranges, and if he is the particular sort of man I believe Finch to be, he keeps a record." The match burned down to his fingers and he shook it out. "That record exists somewhere. When I find it, the question of who forged what and for whose benefit will answer itself." The morning light lay quietly across the Baker Street rooftops, and for a time, neither of us spoke. Chapter 8. The Quiet Experiment. Holmes spent the greater part of Friday in his room, a circumstance which, in the early years of our association, I might have attributed to one of his periodic retreats into introspection, or, less charitably, to the black moods that sometimes descended upon him between cases. I had long since learned to distinguish these states, and what I observed during that Friday was neither. The sounds that reached me through the closed door were methodical and purposive, the occasional movement of a chair, the turning of pages, once the brief scratch of a pen. He was preparing something, and he was preparing it with the care a surgeon gives to an instrument that admits no imprecision. He emerged at 4:30 in the afternoon with 2 sheets of paper folded inside his breast pocket, and a look of contained readiness about him that I associated with the latter stages of his investigations, when the hypothesis has been formed and what remains is to test it against the resistances of the actual world. "We're going to Surrey again," he said, taking his coat from the hook. "All 4 of them, Watson. I've arranged it through Penbury, who has the authority to summon them on estate business. They will be assembled at the Vexley house at 6 o'clock. He paused at the door. "I should be glad if you would observe carefully this evening. Not Holmes, not the documents, not the room. Observe the people." The journey gave me time to think over what he had not said, which was, in its way, more instructive than what he had. He had found, or believed he had found, something during that long Friday in his room. Whatever it was had not altered the direction of his conclusions so much as confirmed them sufficiently to warrant what I recognized, from past experience, as a controlled demonstration. Holmes occasionally employed such demonstrations not to gather new evidence, but to settle existing evidence into its final arrangement by introducing a known variable and observing the reactions it produced. We, the 5 of us, assembled in the drawing-room of the Vexley house: Penbury, Clara Vexley, Mrs. Dalloway and Finch, with Holmes and myself completing the number. Penbury had communicated only that Mr. Holmes wished to present certain findings relating to the disputed document, and that the presence of all parties was requested as a matter of legal propriety. The room had the charged, careful quality of a space in which several people are exercising simultaneous self-control, each aware of the others and watchful in the particular way of those who share a concealed history. Holmes produced his first sheet of paper and passed it, without comment, to Penbury, who read it and passed it on. It moved around the room in silence. I watched each face as it bent over the page. The document was, as I could see when it reached me, a fabricated variation of the forged instrument, altered in its dates, its property descriptions, and the form of the notarial seal, but preserving the essential structure of the original. It was, in other words, a different forgery purporting to the same general purpose, and the alterations were of the kind that would be immediately visible to anyone who had studied the original closely. Clara Vexley read it with a slight frown that deepened as she continued, the frown of a person encountering something unexpected and attempting to reconcile it with prior knowledge. When she looked up, she said directly to Holmes, "This is not the same document. Several particulars are different." Her confusion was unfeigned. I was as certain of it as I have been of most things. Mrs. Dalloway read it without visible expression, but when she set it down, her hands did not return immediately to her lap. They remained on the arm of her chair for a moment before being recalled to composure. A small thing, but a human one. Finch, when the page reached him, held it for rather longer than the others. His eyes moved down the text at a measured pace, and then, near the foot of the second paragraph, they stopped. Not paused in thought, but stopped, as a watch stops. His recovery was swift and competent, and when he raised his eyes, their expression was one of polite attention, but the interval had been there, and it had been sufficient. Holmes retrieved the paper without comment and produced the second sheet from his pocket. This one he did not circulate. He held it before him and spoke from it, quoting two brief passages concerning the management of Penbury's professional seal, its storage arrangements, and the identity of those who had held a key to the relevant cabinet during the years of Finch's employment at the firm. "These details," said Holmes, "derive from the employment records of Penbury and Associates, which I examined yesterday at the firm's Holborn offices. They establish that during the period between 1876 and 1881, 3 persons held keys to the cabinet containing the notarial apparatus: Mr. Penbury himself, his senior partner, Mr. Aldous Cray, who died in 1883, and the firm's senior clerk, who held a courtesy key for administrative purposes during the partner's absences." He looked at Finch. "From 1878 to 1881, Holmes continued. That senior clerk was Silas Finch." The room was entirely still. Penbury had the look of a man receiving a bill he had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. Mrs. Dalloway's hands were perfectly motionless. Clara Vexley sat straight in her chair, her grey eyes moving between Holmes and Finch with an intelligence that was rapidly assembling something from the pieces being laid before her. Finch himself, I will say to his credit, did not dissemble. His face underwent a brief private reckoning, visible only in its conclusion, which was a kind of settled gravity, the expression not of a man cornered but of a man who has arrived, by a longer road than he intended, at a destination he had perhaps always expected to reach. "You had the seal," said Holmes, "lead or access to a wax impression of it precise enough to produce a functional reproduction, the ink you had preserved since the time of the Rookwood proceedings, the signature you had spent 20 years in proximity to documents that bore it." He set the paper down. "What you lacked, for a long time, was the occasion." "Mrs. Vexley's death provided it," Finch said. His voice was even, almost reflective, as though he were considering a matter somewhat removed from his immediate person. "It did." Holmes's tone was neither prosecutorial nor gentle. It was, if anything, attentive, as a physician's is when a patient begins, after prolonged resistance, to describe the actual nature of a pain. "And the document, when you created it, was not designed to deceive. It was designed to disturb, to force into daylight what had been managed out of it." Finch said nothing, but the quality of his silence was acknowledgment. "What I require now," said Holmes, "is the record you kept. You are not a careless man, and you did not embark on this course without ensuring that the original crime was documented in a form that would survive your own participation in the present one." He paused. "I believe it was kept in the lower drawer of Mrs. Vexley's writing cabinet, which you accessed after her death and before Clara arrived to conduct her inventory." Something passed across Finch's face at that, a flicker of something that might, under different circumstances, have been surprised respect. "It is in my room," he said at last. "I will provide it willingly." "Thank you." Holmes turned to the room at large. With the composed authority of a man who has concluded the preparatory work and is reserving the rest, for a moment more properly suited to full disclosure. "I shall ask all of you to remain available over the coming days. There is one further matter, which I am not yet in a position to address this evening, but which will require our collective attention very shortly." Mrs. Dalloway's gaze during these last words had not moved from the fire. Her hands were entirely still. I watched her, and felt, with the particular unease that had been gathering since Lestrade first told us about the Saturday evening visitor, that the document and the ink and the seal were not, in the end, the centre of the matter. On the drive back to London, Holmes sat with his arms folded and his chin inclined slightly forward, and did not speak until the gas lamps of the outer suburbs had given way to the denser illumination of the city. "You saw Finch," I said. "Yes." He turned from the window. "But more importantly, Watson, did you see Mrs. Dalloway?" I told him that I had. "Then you understand," he said simply, "why tomorrow will be considerably less quiet than this evening." Chapter 9. The Signature of Guilt. Finch's record proved, when Holmes examined it that same night in Baker Street, to be a document of considerable thoroughness. It had been compiled over years rather than weeks, the handwriting shifting across its pages from the careful copperplate of a young clerk to the smaller, more compressed script of a man grown careful with age. There were dates, names, figures, and copies of correspondence. A detailed reconstruction of the Rookwood proceedings from the vantage point of one who had stood at their mechanical centre. There were also, bound within the final pages, 3 letters in Honoria Vexley's hand that removed any residual ambiguity about her direction of the original fraud, and a memorandum in Penbury's own writing which referred, with the discretion of a professional man, to the satisfactory resolution of the filing difficulty. Holmes read it through twice before setting it down. His expression throughout was attentive rather than satisfied, the look of a man confirming rather than discovering, and when he finally spoke it was to say, with the quiet finality of a case that has found its shape, "Tomorrow morning, the full company, Lestrade as well." I sent the telegram to Lestrade myself before retiring, and in the morning we were again on the Surrey train, Holmes with Finch's record in his inner pocket, and that particular quality of compressed energy about him that preceded his formal revelations. The sky had cleared overnight, and the countryside appeared scrubbed and specific beneath it, each detail rendered with autumnal precision. They were all assembled when we arrived, Penbury by the window with the look of a man attending his own inquest, Clara Vexley in the chair she had occupied throughout, upright and watchful. Finch stood near the door, and I thought the slight change in his bearing since the previous evening was not diminishment, but something closer to relief, the posture of a man who has carried a weight so long that its removal leaves him temporarily uncertain how to stand. Lestrade occupied a position near the fireplace with his notebook already open, the professional reflex of a man who does not trust his memory when testimony is being given. Mrs. Dalloway sat where she had sat before, in the high-backed chair by the window, and she alone of the company did not look up when Holmes and I entered. Holmes stood at the centre of the room and began without preamble. He laid out the Rookwood affair in its full particulars, drawing where necessary from Finch's record, and the room received it in a silence that was not the silence of surprise but of recognition. He described the suppression of the deed, the distribution of its benefits, the 20 years of collective silence that had followed. He did not moralize. He presented the sequence of events as a mechanism presents itself, each component in its place and its function rendered plain by its relationship to the others. Then he turned to the present case, 6 weeks ago, he said, Finch wrote to each of the surviving participants informing them of his intention to bring the original fraud to light. He had preserved the means to do so, as this record demonstrates, and Mrs. Vexley's death had removed the single obligation that had kept him silent. He had served her faithfully for 14 years, in part from genuine loyalty, in part, I think, from the hope that proximity might one day provide him an opportunity to make amends. Her death freed him from both. Finch did not look up, but the set of his shoulders shifted fractionally. Lyle's response to Finch's letter was to disregard it entirely. He communicated to Mrs. Dalloway his confidence that the matter could be managed, by which he meant suppressed, and took no further action for 3 weeks. It was only when the forged document surfaced through the legal channels attending Mrs. Vexley's estate, and Penbury brought it to my attention, that Lyle understood Finch had moved from intention to act. Holmes paused. At that point, Lyle contacted Finch directly and demanded a meeting. The meeting took place at the Vexley house, 9 days before Lyle's death. I have the date from Finch's own account, corroborated by the household diary, which Miss Vexley permitted me to consult yesterday afternoon. I had not known he had done this, and filed the information with the small number of Holmes's unannounced movements that I had come to accept as simply characteristic. The meeting was not productive. Yet Lyle threatened Finch with legal proceedings for forgery, which was ironic given the circumstances, but not without practical force. Finch declined to withdraw the document. They parted without resolution. Holmes turned slightly, and the angle of his attention, though he had not yet looked directly at her, moved perceptibly toward Mrs. Dalloway. Lyle returned to London. Mrs. Dalloway, who had been present in the house during the meeting, and who had more cause than any remaining party to fear what Finch's record contained, drew her own conclusions. She understood that Lyle, for all his confidence, was unlikely to prevail by legal means against a man in possession of what Finch possessed. She understood that her own name appeared in that record with a specificity that Lyle's bluster would not protect her from. He paused. And she understood, from 14 years of intimate household observation, that aconitine could be obtained from the garden of this house, where monkshood has grown along the kitchen wall for many years. The room was absolutely still. She called upon Lyle on the Saturday evening, admitted without hesitation because he knew her, and had perhaps been expecting some communication following the failed meeting with Finch. She arranged the document on the desk because she understood correctly that its presence would complicate the investigation and direct attention toward the question of the forgery, rather than toward herself. Holmes's voice remained level throughout, unhurried, as though he were reading from a text whose conclusion had been known to him from the first page. The locked door and latched window were Lyle's own habits. Not contrivances of hers. She had no need of contrivance. She left by the front door as she had entered, and walked to the corner of the street before engaging a cab, which is why the housekeeper observed her arriving on foot but did not remark on her departure. Mrs. Dalloway had not moved during this recitation. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes lowered, and she had the look of a woman who has known for some days that a particular morning was coming, and has spent the interval not in denial but in a kind of exhausted preparation. The angle of the wound, Holmes continued, addressing now the room at large, as Watson confirmed from the post-mortem, is consistent with the administration of a substance to a seated man by someone positioned to his left and slightly behind him. The ink staining on the third finger of Mrs. and Dalloway's left hand, which I observed at our very first meeting, and which she attributed to correspondence, is of the particular dark variety produced by iron gall. She had handled the document before it was placed on Lyle's desk, which is to say she had prepared it, and her evasive phrasing throughout our conversations has navigated with extraordinary precision around every specific question bearing on her own movements that Saturday evening while answering, with apparent candour, every question that did not. He looked at her directly at last. "Mrs. Dalloway," he said, "I believe you understand that I have laid the matter as fully before you as before Inspector Lestrade." She raised her eyes then, and what was in them was not the composure I had observed at our first meeting, nor the strained stillness of subsequent ones. but something plainer and harder and, I thought, not entirely without dignity. "I understand," she said. Lestrade stepped forward with the quiet efficiency of a man performing a familiar duty in unfamiliar circumstances. Clara Vexley had gone very still in her chair. Penbury was looking at the floor. Finch watched with the expression of a man who has achieved what he set out to achieve, and finds the achievement rather different from what he had imagined it would feel like. Holmes moved to the window while Lestrade attended to the formal proceedings, and stood looking out at the Surrey morning with his hands clasped behind his back. I came to stand beside him, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "She killed him to protect a secret that was already lost," I said at last. "Yes." His voice was quiet. "She made Watson, the oldest and most human of miscalculations. She acted to prevent an outcome that was already, by the time she acted, inevitable." He turned from the window. "The past, once it has been set in motion toward disclosure, does not stop for the convenience of those who would rather it did." Chapter 10. The echoes of the past. The formalities of Mrs. Dalloway's arrest were completed with a minimum of ceremony, which seemed, under the circumstances, the only appropriate manner of conducting them. Lestrade was professional throughout, his tone neither triumphant nor apologetic, and Mrs. Dalloway herself submitted to the proceedings with a composure so thoroughly sustained that I found it, in the end, rather more affecting than any display of feeling could have been. She asked, before being escorted from the room, whether she might collect a few personal items from her room in the East Wing, and Lestrade, with a decency that did him credit, accompanied her himself rather than sending a constable. While they were gone, the remaining company sat in silence of the particular kind that follows the resolution of a long tension, not peaceful exactly, but emptied, like a room after a storm has passed through it, and removed everything that was not fixed securely to the floor. It was Clara Vexley who spoke first, and she addressed herself to Holmes with a directness that I had come to recognise as characteristic of her. "My aunt," she said, "you have not said in so many words what you believe of her." Holmes considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Your aunt was a woman of considerable capability, who employed those capabilities in the deliberate destruction of a man of modest means for the purposes of material acquisition. The fraud was premeditated, sustained across months of legal proceedings, and pursued without remorse. Elias Rookwood lost his land, his livelihood, and within the year his life, though the last cannot be laid directly at her door." He paused. "She was also, by every account, a woman capable of loyalty to those she chose to extend it toward, and she inspired, in Finch at least, a devotion that outlasted his knowledge of what she had done. People," he added, with the dispassion of a naturalist, "are rarely constructed for our convenience." Clara absorbed this without visible distress, and with what I took to be the satisfaction of a woman receiving an honest answer to an honest question. "And the estate?" she asked. "The document being fraudulent, what remains?" "The original will stand," said Holmes. "The charitable trust receive their allocations, and the provisions made for you are restored. You will wish to consult with a solicitor." He glanced briefly at Penbury as he said this, with an expression that conveyed, without requiring words, that the solicitor in question ought perhaps to be someone other than the present one. Penbury received this glance with the stillness of a man who has accepted the full weight of what the morning has placed upon him. He had said almost nothing since Holmes began his account, and he said little now beyond asking quietly whether he was to be arrested. Holmes told him that the matter of his professional conduct in the Rookwood proceedings would be a question for the Law Society and the relevant legal authorities, and that Lestrade had been advised of the particulars. It was not an answer that offered comfort, but it was a truthful one, and Penbury, I thought, had reached the point where truth, however unwelcome, was preferable to the continued effort of avoiding it. Finch remained by the door throughout, and as the others began to move to gather themselves for the altered shape of the day, Holmes approached him with a quietness that was different from his usual economy of movement, more considered. "Your record," Holmes said, "will serve its purpose, and whether the courts will look with full severity upon a man who forged a document in order to expose a fraud is a question I cannot answer with certainty, but I can tell you that the manner in which you have conducted yourself this morning will not go unobserved." Finch looked at him steadily. He was not, I thought, a man who required reassurance, but neither was he immune to acknowledgement. "I am aware that I have not come to this cleanly," he said. "I committed a forgery. The fact that the original crime was worse does not alter that." "No," Holmes agreed, "it does not. But the law, when it is at its best, distinguishes between the man who acts from calculation and the man who acts from conscience, even when the action itself is the same." He offered no further comfort and asked for none to be inferred, which was, I believe, is precisely what Finch required. We left the Vexley house in the early afternoon, the three of us, Holmes, Lestrade and I, walking together down the gravel drive in the thin October sunshine. Lestrade was uncharacteristically reflective, his notebook for once not in evidence, his hands in the pockets of his overcoat. 20 years, he said after a while. 20 years they all lived with it. "Rather less comfortably than appearances suggested," said Holmes. "And Finch spent 20 years preparing that document?" "Not preparing it, I think. Contemplating it. The preparation was relatively recent. The contemplation was lifelong." Holmes's tone was not unkind. There is a distinction between the decision to act and the act itself that we often collapse in retrospect into a single moment. For most people who carry a guilty secret, the majority of their inner life is spent somewhere in between, neither fully silent nor fully ready to speak. Lestrade considered this. "I suppose that is either very comforting or very alarming, depending on one's situation." "Quite so," said Holmes, and something in his manner suggested that he had decided this was an adequate conclusion to that particular line of thought. We took the afternoon train back to London. Holmes slept for a portion of the journey, or appeared to, his head inclined against the window and the countryside moving behind him in the pale-coloured procession of a Surrey autumn. I sat with my notebook open, but wrote very little, finding that the case, now complete, was still arranging itself in my mind into the shape it would eventually take on the page, the shape in which motive and evidence and character composed themselves into something intelligible. I found myself thinking not of Mrs. Dalloway, whose guilt was clear and whose fate would be determined by processes I could not influence, nor of Penbury, whose professional reckoning was approaching with the inevitability of a delayed but punctual train, but of Finch, standing by that door in the drawing-room of the Vexley house, watching the conclusion of a plan that had cost him more than he had calculated and delivered rather less. There was something in his bearing, in those final minutes, that I had been trying to name precisely, and it was only on the train, watching the flat Surrey fields give way to the tiled roofs of the outer suburbs, that I identified it. It was the bearing of a man who has done what he set out to do, and discovered in the doing of it that the doing was never really the point. That what he had wanted, across 20 years of silent accumulation, was not exposure or justice, or even reckoning, but simply to have told the truth to someone who would hear it fully and understand what it meant. Holmes had provided that, whatever else the law would subsequently provide or withhold. We were back at Baker Street by 6 o'clock. Mrs. Hudson brought up a cold supper, which Holmes largely ignored, and a pot of tea, which he did not. He sat in his chair by the fire and stared into the middle distance with the particular vacancy of a man whose mind has closed its account on one matter and not yet found the next to occupy it. After a time I asked him whether the case, now concluded, he had offered him anything of genuine interest, which was my customary way of inviting his reflections without appearing to do so. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Every case offers something of interest to the attentive observer, Watson. This one offered rather more than most because its central mechanism was not the forgery, which was merely the instrument, and not the murder, which was merely the consequence. Its central mechanism was time." He reached for his pipe. "The manner in which 20 years of silence does not neutralize a crime but concentrates it, refining the guilt of those who carry it, and the determination of those who cannot put it down. He paused. The past, Watson, is never truly past. It merely awaits the proper signature to be revealed. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, Baker Street received the evening in its usual manner, unhurried and indifferent. I opened my notebook and began, at last, to write.